Somewhere in your bathroom right now, there's probably a small, disposable, completely unremarkable product that took the entire modern industrial world, factories, synthetic materials, global supply chains to manufacture, and you've likely never once wondered what existed before it. For the overwhelming majority of human history, that product simply didn't exist. Half the species has been menstruating every single month for as long as humans have existed, roughly a few hundred cycles across an average lifetime, a recurring biological event as old and as universal as eating or sleeping. And yet it's one of the most consistently under-discussed parts of the entire human story, oddly absent from most retellings of how ancient people actually lived, skipped over almost entirely in favor of hunting, fire, and tools. So what did women actually do for hundreds of thousands of years, quietly and without complaint, before any of this modern convenience was ever invented? The practical answer turns out to be simpler and more resourceful than you might expect. Across wildly different cultures, continents, and climates separated by oceans and thousands of years, women independently converged on remarkably similar solutions without ever comparing notes. Soft moss pressed and shaped to hold its form, chosen because it was abundant, absorbent, and free for the taking in forested regions. Absorbent plant fibers, sometimes woven into something closer to fabric, sometimes simply gathered loose and folded. Softened animal hides, worked until pliable enough to be comfortable against skin. Later, reusable cloth, made from whatever fabric a given culture already had access to, washed in a nearby stream and used again the next month, and the month after that, for years at a time. None of it required writing anything down, or a single named inventor, or passing along some official patented design. It just required paying close attention to what the local environment already offered, and generation after generation quietly refining what already worked well enough into something that worked a little better. But refining a material is one thing. Building an actual physical space around this recurring, predictable event is something else entirely. And there's real archaeological evidence that at least some societies did exactly that. In eastern Kentucky, a rock shelter called Newt Kash sat largely unexamined, its contents cataloged but not fully understood, until the archaeologist Cheryl Claassen went back decades later and took a much closer look at what had actually been found there. Excavators had already pulled out something unusual for what should have been an ordinary campsite. Soft plant fiber bedding, carefully arranged rather than scattered, spoons carved from shell, a cradleboard for carrying an infant, a notably wide range of medicinal plants, more variety than a single household's everyday cooking would call for. Taken individually, none of it proves much of anything. Taken together, Claassen argued the combination made far more sense as a dedicated retreat, a place physically set apart specifically for menstruation, childbirth, and recovery from illness, rather than a random household dumping ground that just happened to accumulate an odd mix of objects. The site is roughly 4,000 years old. Long before anyone wrote the idea down anywhere, someone in that community had already decided this particular recurring life event deserved its own physical space, stocked in advance with exactly the right supplies, ready whenever it was needed again. That impulse, setting menstruation apart with its own designated space, wasn't unique to one shelter in Kentucky. Cross-cultural surveys of traditional societies around the world have found some version of a menstrual hut, a separate structure or explicitly marked area set aside from the rest of daily life, in a striking number of the cultures studied, spanning nearly every inhabited continent, from societies that never had any contact with each other at all. It's tempting from a modern vantage point to read all of this as pure restriction, women simply pushed out of normal life and isolated somewhere out of sight. Some of it clearly was exactly that, rooted in taboo, fear, and the belief that menstrual blood carried some kind of contaminating danger. But that's not the whole picture either, and collapsing every version of the custom into the same simple story misses something real. In several documented traditional societies, that same separate space also functioned as something much closer to rest, a stretch of days genuinely protected from the usual grinding workload of food preparation, childcare, and hard physical labor, spent instead alongside other women going through the exact same thing at the exact same time, talking, resting, recovering, Whether any specific version of the custom helped or harmed the women actually living inside it clearly varied enormously from one culture to the next, and probably from one household to the next within the same culture. What doesn't vary nearly as much is the underlying pattern itself. How many completely unconnected societies, with no way of ever comparing notes, landed on the exact same basic idea independently, over and over again, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. One researcher pushed the implications of that repeated pattern much further than almost anyone else in the field has been willing to. The anthropologist Chris Knight proposed something genuinely bold in his book Blood Relations, published in 1991, after years spent trying to explain a stubborn gap in the existing theories of human origins. Knight argued that menstruation itself, and how early human groups responded to it together as a coordinated group, may have been one of the actual sparks behind human culture, not a minor footnote sitting somewhere off to the side of the real story. His theory centers on red ochre, a reddish iron-rich pigment found in striking, almost excessive abundance at ancient sites right across the archaeological record, far more of it, in far more places, than any purely practical use like tanning hides or hafting stone tools onto handles can fully account for on its own. Knight proposed that women used the pigment symbolically, marking themselves during and even outside their actual menstrual cycle, coordinating as a group to synchronize a shared signal and assert real collective control over exactly when reproduction happened within the group, and just as importantly, when it deliberately didn't. It's a genuinely controversial idea, still actively debated and far from settled science today, decades after it was first proposed. But the fact that a serious credentialed researcher could build an entire theory of the origins of human symbolism, morality, and social order around menstruation specifically, and still be taken seriously enough within academia to argue about at length, says something meaningful on its own. This was never treated as a minor footnote in every corner of the field. To at least one influential, still-cited theory, it was close to the whole story of how humans became human in the first place. Put all three pieces together, and menstruation stops looking like the minor, mildly embarrassing biological footnote it so often gets reduced to today, something briefly mentioned and quickly moved past. It was a recurring, entirely predictable event that shaped where women gathered. What ordinary materials got quietly refined generation after generation until they worked reliably well, which physical spaces got deliberately built and maintained specifically around it, and possibly, if Knight is right about even part of his theory, how humans first organized themselves into the kind of cooperating, symbol-using groups that everything else people usually credit for the rise of civilization, language, art, religion was eventually built directly on top of. Half of every generation that ever lived managed this, quietly, competently, month after month for their entire adult lives, using nothing more than moss, plant fiber, softened hide, washed cloth, a dedicated shelter when one existed, real medicinal knowledge passed down without ever being written anywhere, and each other for company and support along the way. No factories, no disposable products shipped in from somewhere else. Just attention, resourcefulness, and a solution passed quietly from one generation of women to the next, refined a little further each time. That's not a footnote tucked into the margins of the real story. That's simply part of how the species actually got here.